March 18th, 1977. It was a Friday, Good Friday to be exact, a holy day, quiet, the kind of day when even the air feels reverent. 6-year-old Mary Boyle was spending the Easter holidays with her grandparents near Ballyshannon, a remote stretch of land in County Donegal, kissed by sea winds and dotted with sheep-speckled fields. Mary was a twin, the younger by a few minutes, and inseparable from her sister Anne. They were mirror images, though not just in the way they looked. They shared secrets, whispers, laughter that was only ever meant for two. But on that day, something shattered that bond forever. Mary left the house with her uncle, heading across the fields to deliver a ladder to a neighbor's farm. A small, ordinary errand in a tight-knit Irish community where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Her uncle says she decided to turn back alone, walking the short path home through the open field, past stone walls and patches of heather. It should have taken her minutes. But Mary never came back. The last child, seen wearing a lilac jacket, black Wellington boots, and innocence so bright it made the sky look dull. The panic began small, as it always does. A few calls across the fields, a glance at the kitchen door, then the realization that no small feet had returned. Within hours, the community was out, searching, shouting her name into the wind. By nightfall, the Gardaí had arrived. The next day, the Irish Defence Forces were combing the hills with helicopters, divers, and dogs. But the field gave nothing back. No shoe, no ribbon, not even a footprint they could say for sure was hers. And just like that, Mary Boyle vanished, gone as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. What followed was decades of heartbreak, questions, and a darkness that seemed to hang over the Donegal hills like a second sky. Her case would become the longest-running missing child investigation in Irish history, a wound that never closed, a name whispered in homes, classrooms, pubs, and eventually on the internet. But in all those years, not one trace of Mary has ever been found. Not one. And yet, people remember, people talk, and some have tried to stay silent. There were rumors from the beginning that Mary had met with an accident, that someone local had done something unspeakable, that there had been a cover-up, the kind of quiet shielding that only small towns and old allegiances can maintain. Her twin sister, Anne, now grown, has spent decades fighting for the truth, pleading, demanding, asking the same question that's echoed across generations: where is Mary? Over the years, new names entered the story. A witness too afraid to go public. A politician's name whispered behind closed doors. Journalists who got too close. Files that seemed to disappear. And a country that wanted answers, but wasn't sure it wanted the truth. Because the truth, in this case, might not just be about a missing child. It might be about something deeper, something older, something that points not just to the hills of Donegal, but to the very institutions trusted to protect the innocent. 47 years have passed, yet the story of Mary Boyle has never faded. It has only grown more complicated, more haunting, more urgent. This is not just a story about a missing girl. It's a story about silence, about what happens when a small child disappears and the world looks away. But to understand what really happened, we have to go back. Mary Teresa Boyle was born on June 14th, 1970, a summer child, as some would say, born under skies that smelled like cut grass and rain. She came into the world just minutes after her twin sister, Anne, and from that moment, they were rarely apart. Two halves of the same heartbeat. You couldn't say Mary without Anne. They were known around their Sligo home for their matching clothes, giggling fits, and the way they instinctively reached for each other's hands, even when they were just walking to school. Their mother, Anne Sr., was young beautiful, and devoted to her girls. Their father, Charlie Boyle, worked in construction. It wasn't a wealthy family, but it was a loving one, marked by warmth, faith, and the kind of closeness that rural Irish families built their lives around. Family was everything. And when Easter holidays came around in 1977, the plan was simple. The girls would visit their grandparents in County Donegal, just a few hours away. A change of pace, fresh air, time with cousins. It wasn't unusual, it was tradition. Mary and Anne were thrilled. The grandparents lived in Cashellard, a small village near Ballyshannon, one of those blink-and-you-miss-it Irish towns where everyone knows everyone, where doors are rarely locked, and where danger feels like something that happens far away. In cities, on the news, not here. Their house was modest, surrounded by wide green fields, the kind where the grass grew tall and thick in spring, where sheep wandered freely, and where the road stretched out like a ribbon through the countryside. There was a kind of stillness there, the kind children both love and fear. Quiet enough to hear birds nesting, quiet enough to lose your thoughts. It was a place Mary knew, a place she'd been to many times before. And on that Good Friday morning, Mary was happy. She'd eaten breakfast with her family. The day was cold but bright, the kind of Irish morning that promises a later mist. Sometime around midday, Mary was seen dancing around the front yard, full of energy, her dark hair pulled back into 2 ponytails. She wore a lilac jacket, blue trousers, and Wellington boots, the same kind every child in Ireland had for playing in mud or crossing fields. There were no signs of fear, no shadow in her eyes. She was just a child, living a moment. But life, as it often does, changed in a single breath. Around lunchtime, Mary's uncle, a man named Jerry Gallagher, planned to carry a ladder to a neighbor's farm. A short trip, one he'd made many times before. Mary asked to come along. It wasn't strange. In small towns, children went on little walks with family all the time. They knew the land, they knew the shortcuts. Jerry agreed, and the two set off, heading toward a sloped field that connected the house to a nearby farm. Along the way, Mary reportedly grew tired or changed her mind. According to Jerry's account, she decided to turn back home alone. He continued on. She vanished. Now, from a logical standpoint, the path Mary was on should have taken her no more than 5 to 7 minutes to walk. It was a clear field, one that opened into the back of her grandparents' home. In daylight, without obstruction. It wasn't thick with trees or difficult terrain. In fact, when people later stood in that very spot and turned their heads, they could see the house in the distance. But Mary never arrived. Her grandmother noticed the silence first. Minutes ticked by, then more. Her twin sister began asking questions. The chatter of cousins grew uneasy. When Jerry returned, alone, and was asked where Mary was, his answer sparked something cold in the air. She turned back. That's when the shouting began. That's when the searching began. Charlie Boyle was called immediately. Mary's father raced from Sligo to Donegal in a panic, arriving to a scene no parent ever wants to witness, his child's name being called into empty air. The Gardaí were contacted shortly after, and a full-scale search was launched by that evening. Volunteers, neighbors, farmers, relatives poured into the fields with flashlights, dogs, and hope that dwindled with every passing hour. Divers searched nearby lakes and bogs. Helicopters circled overhead. The defense forces deployed search teams trained in wilderness operations. Houses were checked. Wells were emptied. Barns, sheds, and even septic tanks were searched, all with Mary's photo in hand. Nothing, not a shred, not a thread, no trace of Mary's jacket, her boots, or her tiny voice carried on the wind. And in the chaos, a haunting realization began to settle in. This wasn't a case of a child getting lost in the woods. This was something else. The media coverage started within days. "Little girl missing in Donegal" flashed across evening headlines. News presenters shared her photo, a sweet, bright-eyed face, missing a front tooth, wearing a smile that reached into your heart. People across Ireland watched in disbelief. How could a child simply disappear, in daylight, from a field surrounded by people who knew her? Police checkpoints were established, cars were stopped, neighbors were interviewed. But as hours turned to days and days to weeks, the questions grew louder, and so did the rumors. The community, once tight-knit, began to close in on itself. Some claimed she'd wandered too far and drowned. Others whispered about a stranger, a car that hadn't been seen before, a scream heard too faintly to act on. And then, more troubling still, suggestions that Mary hadn't been alone when she vanished, and that someone knew more than they were saying. But in those first hours, first days, it was all raw fear, desperation. They searched until their feet bled, until the wind died, until the hope that filled their lungs began to turn to stone. By the end of the week, there was still no sign of Mary Boyle. She had vanished without a sound. By Friday evening, March 18th, 1977, the rolling hills of Cashellard no longer felt like home. The sun had dipped behind the stone fences, casting long shadows across the fields where only hours earlier Mary Boyle had walked with her uncle. That peaceful patch of Donegal land, with its sheep and silent fences, now pulsed with panic. Her grandparents' house had become a command post. The kitchen table was covered in maps, cups of cold tea, and the shaking hands of family members trying to remain calm. Outside, neighbors were arriving in pairs, holding flashlights, whispering prayers, the kind of people who'd never missed a Sunday Mass, now walking shoulder to shoulder through the damp grass with sinking hearts. The first official report went out that evening. 6-year-old Mary Boyle, last seen wearing a lilac jacket and black wellies, had disappeared from the rural townland of Cashellard around lunchtime. The Gardaí took it seriously from the start. There had been too much time, too much space between when she was last seen and when anyone realized she was missing. The night search was relentless. Locals brought lamps, pitchforks, anything they had. Helicopters from Finner Camp swept the area with infrared. Divers searched bogs and ponds. A local priest, Father Gallagher, stood beside the family that night and said quietly, "The land doesn't lie, but sometimes it doesn't speak either." By the next morning, it was no longer just a community concern. It was a national emergency. The defense forces joined. Search dogs combed the hills. Volunteers fanned out in tighter grids, marking every tree, every gate, every ditch. Mary's photo was printed and passed from hand to hand. Her face stared up from desks in Garda stations, on lampposts, in grocery stores, on the front pages of Irish papers, and still nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a muddy footprint, not a cry in the night, as if she'd vanished between one breath and the next. Investigators began retracing every minute. The uncle, Jerry Gallagher, was interviewed. His account was consistent. They were delivering a ladder to a neighbor, and Mary had chosen to go back on her own. She didn't seem scared. She just wanted to return. But the timeline was strange. How could a child disappear on a 5-minute walk in open daylight with no one seeing a thing? No tire tracks, no broken fence, no sign of struggle, no witness. The police scoured the area between the house and the field. They used sticks to test the ground for any hollows, any signs of disturbed soil. Farmers opened their sheds, their cellars, their barns, many in tears as they did so. Days passed, and still the land held its silence. Charlie Boyle, Mary's father, was inconsolable. He stayed up for days, combing fields with his bare hands. He refused to go home. How could he? One of his daughters was missing, and her twin, Anne, was now sleeping alone, waking up screaming for her sister in the dark. The girls had never been apart, not once. Anne was only 6, but she understood. Somehow, in that way, children do. She cried without making sound, stared out the window for hours. She told her mother, "I think Mary's gone away somewhere far." The Gardaí began considering new angles. One theory, she'd fallen into a hidden bog hole. Another, she'd been taken, perhaps by someone passing through, a traveler, a stranger, someone who knew the area and the right time to strike. But Donegal wasn't the kind of place people passed through without being noticed. And no one, not a single local, could remember seeing a suspicious car or face that day. Then came the whispers. Someone local, someone known, someone trusted, because how else does a child disappear in a place so small, so familiar? The media began asking tougher questions. A child vanishing in open country was one thing, but the complete absence of evidence, no trace, no sign, made it more than a mystery. It made it a problem, something unnatural. The public grew uneasy. Journalists asked why the Gardaí weren't making arrests, why no one had been brought in for deeper questioning. But behind the scenes, something darker was happening. Some files were reportedly marked confidential. Some investigators were told to drop lines of questioning. A few family members began to feel watched, controlled, told what not to say, what not to remember. And over time, a strange paralysis took over. No progress, no answers, no suspect, just silence. The kind that weighs more than grief. The official search ended after several days, not because hope had returned, but because the authorities had exhausted every visible option. They had combed the area so many times they could trace the ridges of the hills in their sleep. But Mary wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. Charlie and Anne Sr. refused to give up. They kept returning to Donegal every weekend, calling out Mary's name, retracing steps that had already been walked 100 times. Volunteers came and went. Anne, the twin, grew quieter. Her smiles disappeared. Something had been carved out of her, something no time could ever refill, and the questions only got louder. Why had Mary been left to walk alone? Why didn't anyone see her on that short stretch of land? Why didn't the Gardaí search certain homes more thoroughly? Why were certain leads not pursued? These questions became the heartbeat of Mary Boyle's case, pounding louder as the years passed, and still no answers came. By the end of spring, 1977, the media moved on. But the family didn't. Mary's name remained etched in the landscape of Donegal, in the wind, in the soil, in the house where she never returned. A girl frozen in time, a disappearance that turned a quiet field into something sacred and cursed. The last confirmed sighting of Mary Boyle was on that narrow path in Cashlard, between a ladder and a farmhouse, between morning and memory. She was never seen again, and so began one of Ireland's most haunting unresolved disappearances, a case where no body was found, no killer charged, no conclusion offered. Just a question, echoing through the years. Where is Mary? The seasons changed, but Mary Boyle never came home. Spring turned to summer. The lambs grew into sheep. The fields in Cashlard turned from green to gold, and in the Boyle household time stopped in strange ways. One twin grew older, and the other stayed 6 years old forever. That's what grief does. It distorts time. It leaves one foot in the past, one in the present, and the heart somewhere else entirely. The search for Mary never truly ended, not for her parents, not for her sister, Not even for the neighbors who'd spent those first frantic days calling her name into the hills. But slowly, inevitably, the rest of the world began to move on. Other headlines took over. Other tragedies stole the spotlight. But for the Boyles, every sunrise was still March 18th. Every morning began with a memory, and every night ended in silence. Her mother, Anne Sr., began to grow quiet. She spoke less in public. She gave fewer interviews. In private, she would set Mary's plate at the table, fold laundry that wasn't there, keep a drawer of her clothes untouched, just in case. Charlie Boyle, once a proud and strong man, became thinner, tired. He kept Mary's photo in his jacket pocket and would take it out on train rides, offering it to strangers with shaking hands. Some said he'd aged a decade in just 2 years, but it was Anne, Mary's twin, who carried the most invisible burden. They had shared everything, a womb, a bed, a language only they seemed to understand. And then, nothing. The day Mary vanished, a part of Anne did too. And as the years went by, that absence only deepened. Imagine growing older and seeing yourself in every birthday photo, knowing the person who should be beside you is still 6 years old in the only photo anyone ever shares. She started writing letters to Mary, drawing pictures, speaking to her in her dreams. At night, she'd ask her parents, "Do you think she's cold? Do you think she's scared?" But no one had answers, and the official investigation after a few years had grown still. Gardaí had followed up on initial tips, revisited the site, and re-interviewed family members, but without new leads or evidence, they quietly let the case fade into the archives. No press conferences, no suspects, no renewed searches, just a file marked missing. By the early 1980s, there were no national updates, no reward posters, no breaking news, just a hollow space in the records of Ireland's missing children, and a wound no one knew how to close. The Boyle family, meanwhile, became divided in their grief. Silence grew where words used to be. Everyone carried their own version of guilt. Some blamed the uncle, Jerry Gallagher, for letting her walk alone. Others believed it was something darker, something the family couldn't bring itself to say out loud, and still others simply didn't know what to believe. Donegal remained largely silent, too. In small towns, silence can be a kind of currency. Some locals speculated quietly behind pub doors, but few were willing to say anything publicly. It wasn't fear, necessarily. It was something older, something ingrained, a belief that you didn't accuse your neighbor, that you didn't shame your parish, that if something unspeakable had happened, it was best left buried. Mary's name, though, never left the hearts of those closest to her. Anne Boyle kept searching. Even as a child, she would draw maps, mark places she thought her sister might be. As she grew into a teenager, she became more determined, more aware that answers weren't just going to come from the police, that maybe someone was hiding something, that maybe justice wasn't waiting. It had to be dragged into the light. She begged for the case to be reopened, for files to be shared, for truth to replace the fog. But each time, she was met with walls. The Gardaí, for years, insisted there was no new evidence, no new reason to pursue further action. And so the wait continued, stretching from years into decades. Some people said maybe she wandered into a bog and drowned, that no one was at fault, that Donegal had swallowed her. But her parents never believed that. There was no bog nearby that hadn't already been searched, no open body of water left unchecked. And even if she had, something would have turned up. A shoe, a strand of hair, a scrap of fabric. But the land had given nothing back. Others quietly believed that someone local had harmed her, and that others had protected them. There were too many unasked questions, too many leads that stopped abruptly, too many names that came up and disappeared just as fast. And in the middle of it all stood Mary's twin, waiting, growing older without her, carrying a grief no child should bear. Her voice, eventually, would become the loudest one. But in those early years, the lost years, she waited. She waited while the world forgot. She waited while officials shifted blame. She waited while others told her to move on. But she didn't, because Mary wasn't just her sister. She was her other half. And the hole left in her place wasn't just emotional, it was existential. A kind of living limbo, a world where one girl grew up with a shadow beside her, and no one but her could see it. As the years passed and the headlines faded, something strange happened. The silence surrounding Mary Boyle's case didn't just grow heavier, it began to attract noise, whispers, theories, a strange sort of obsession. Not just from grieving family members, but from journalists, private investigators, and eventually the Internet. The absence of answers became a vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Some theories were simple, logical. Perhaps Mary had met with an accident and her body had never been found. Ireland, after all, was filled with bogland and hidden terrain. Places where time stands still and the land keeps secrets. But those who knew the field where Mary disappeared, those who had walked it hundreds of times, knew that nothing had been missed. It had been searched with military precision, dug, drained, mapped, and measured. There was no place left for her to be, unless someone had moved her. That's where the darker theories began. The idea that Mary had been harmed, not by a stranger, but by someone she knew, someone local, someone trusted. The name that kept coming up in hushed conversations was her uncle, Jerry Gallagher, the last person to see her. He maintained from the beginning that she'd turned back on her own. But for many, that answer wasn't enough. Why had a 6-year-old girl been sent alone across an open field? Why didn't anyone see her after that moment? And if she had wandered off, why wasn't her body ever found? The suspicion grew not necessarily because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Over time, a chilling theory began to take shape, that someone in the community had harmed Mary, that others knew and said nothing, that the case had been deliberately buried, not just by fear or shame, but by power. That's when the word cover-up first appeared. It was years later, in the 2000s, when Irish journalists began revisiting the case in detail. One documentary in particular, aired on an independent channel, suggested that high-level interference may have derailed the original investigation, that certain leads were never followed, that files were sealed, that a suspect, believed to have been known to Gardaí, was never charged or even publicly named. Even more disturbing, the idea that a politician may have intervened to protect the identity of a suspect. These weren't just conspiracy theories whispered in back rooms. These were statements made on record by retired detectives, by journalists, by Mary's own twin sister, Anne. She, now an adult, had become the most vocal advocate for justice. Anne Boyle began calling out the silence directly, naming people, demanding files, asking questions no one else would ask. And what she found, or rather, what she didn't find, shook her. She discovered that some of the Gardaí who worked on the case had never written official reports, that certain tips had been dismissed without follow-up, that people in the community had long believed they knew what happened, but never felt safe saying it. Anne claimed she had been warned not to pursue the truth, that speaking out would cause trouble, but she didn't stop. She took her story to national media, to YouTube, to anyone who would listen. She called out specific names, specific timelines, specific silences, and each time she did, more people came forward, quietly, sometimes anonymously, with their own fragments. There were rumors of a man who confessed while drunk in a pub, of a woman who saw something but was too afraid to speak, of locals who moved away not long after Mary vanished, of a file that existed, then disappeared. One former Garda even said that he had been ordered not to question certain people, that politics, not justice, had determined the limits of the investigation. Still, no arrests. Still, no charges. Still, no Mary. The online community of amateur sleuths began to take notice. Forums appeared. Timelines were reconstructed. Maps were posted and studied. Theories went viral. Some reached too far. Others were too cruel. But somewhere in the chaos, a chilling consensus began to form. Someone knows. Someone in that small town in Donegal, someone who was there on that cold March day, knows exactly what happened to Mary Boyle. But for reasons buried in fear, loyalty, or shame, they have never spoken, and each year the silence deepens. Anne, undeterred, has continued to fight. She's called for cold case reviews, for public inquests, for politicians to step in. She has stood on stages and in front of cameras and spoken words no sister should ever have to say, all while carrying the ache of not just losing Mary, but of living in a world that seems determined not to find her. Some say she's brave, others have called her dangerous. But Anne doesn't care, because to her, Mary isn't a mystery. She's a sister, a voice, a smile, a laugh frozen in time. And if justice doesn't come naturally, she will drag it into the light. Theories continue to swirl, that Mary stumbled upon something she shouldn't have, that someone panicked and covered it up, that the truth is known, but locked behind secrets older than the case itself. And maybe, just maybe, the fear isn't about what happened. Maybe it's about who would fall if the truth were finally spoken. Because this was never just about a child who disappeared. It's about a town that closed its mouth, and a family that refused to do the same. For years, Mary Boyle's name lingered like a shadow in Ireland's collective memory. Occasionally, a journalist would bring it up again, a short article, a passing mention, a photo in a retrospective about missing children. But in the digital age, Mary's case didn't just fade. It began to evolve. In the early 2010s, something changed. A new generation began asking questions, not through newspapers, but through blogs, YouTube videos, online petitions. Suddenly, the story was no longer confined to Donegal or even Ireland. It was global. People from across the world were reading about Mary, watching documentaries, sending emails to local officials, asking why. After all these years, there were still no answers. And then, in 2016, a spark ignited. That year, a documentary titled Mary Boyle. The untold story was uploaded online. It wasn't from a major broadcaster. It wasn't sponsored by a government agency. It was created by an independent journalist named Gemma O'Doherty, known for her investigations into institutional corruption in Ireland. The documentary was raw, emotional, and deeply disturbing. In it, former Garda detective Aidan Murray went on camera, not just to speak about the case, but to make allegations. He claimed that during the original investigation in 1977, he had a suspect in mind, someone he believed should have been thoroughly questioned, someone known locally. But, according to Murray, when he raised the alarm, he was told to leave it alone, that a politician had contacted the Gardaí, that pressure had been applied, and the investigation stalled. The implication was clear. Someone had stepped in to shield the suspect, and Mary Boyle's case had been buried under that protection. The documentary included not just Murray's claims, but also statements from Mary's twin sister Anne, who confirmed that she had long suspected a cover-up. She named names. She recounted warnings she'd received. She spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes from decades of pain turned into purpose. The video spread like wildfire, hundreds of thousands of views. Comments from around the world, people asking, writing, demanding answers. Questions flooded Irish social media. Politicians were approached. Reporters began circling again. The case, once cold and forgotten, was now hot, burning. What surfaced wasn't a new piece of physical evidence. It was worse. It was the suggestion that the truth had been there all along and deliberately ignored. The reaction was divided. Some praised the documentary. They said it finally gave voice to the suspicions people had whispered for decades, that it named the elephant in the room, that it made it impossible for authorities to look away. Others criticized it. They said it was irresponsible, speculative, too emotional, that it risked slandering people without charges, without trial. But the effect was undeniable. For the first time in decades, Mary's case was reopened by the Gardaí for review. Not fully, not as a new investigation, but as a cold case review, prompted by public outcry and renewed media attention. The Garda commissioner was questioned in the Dáil Éireann, Ireland's parliament. Politicians were urged to support a public inquest, and something else surfaced too. A private investigator, Kevin McMahon, came forward. He said he had spent years looking into the case independently, interviewing locals, following the paper trail. What he found mirrored what Anne had always suspected, a wall of silence in the community, people who claimed they knew something, but refused to go on record, stories that changed slightly each time they were told, names mentioned in the same breath as fear. Then came the tips, anonymous letters, emails, messages to reporters, hints about a location, a conversation, a confession overheard. Nothing solid, but enough to stir the air, enough to reignite hope or terror. One message suggested looking near a specific outbuilding in the Cashellard area. Another claimed that a key piece of evidence, perhaps an item of clothing, had once been stored in a local property and later removed. Still others pointed to political figures from the 1970s, known to have connections in Donegal, and hinted at favors exchanged behind closed doors. No single tip broke the case open, but together they formed a chilling mosaic, a map of complicity, a story of what happens when truth is inconvenient and how silence can be bought. Anne Boyle, now a woman in her 40s, didn't flinch. She kept speaking, louder, sharper. She appeared in interviews, on panels, at protests, holding her sister's photo in one hand and Ireland's conscience in the other. She didn't want revenge. She wanted her sister back, or at least her sister's name cleared from the fog. The documentary, the statements, the reinvestigations, they were not discoveries in the traditional sense. No body was found, no object unearthed, but in a way what surfaced in those years was far more powerful. The truth, or at least the crack in the silence. For the first time, the world saw Mary's case not just as a tragedy, but as a scandal, a question of power. A wound on Ireland's soul that had never healed because it had never been allowed to. And in that crack, something began to move. Something the land hadn't given up, but the people might. What followed the resurfacing of Mary Boyle's story in 2016 wasn't just public outcry, it was a reckoning. The clue wasn't a shoe or a bone or a hidden diary. It was the clue no one expected. A voice, Detective Aidan Murray's voice, in that now infamous documentary. For decades, people had whispered that the case had been mishandled, even buried. But here was a man who had been there, saying it on camera. That changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a girl who disappeared. It was about a system that might have chosen silence over truth. And now, Ireland was listening. The Gardaí, under public and political pressure, announced that they would review the original case files. They assured the public that every possible lead would be revisited. They reaffirmed their commitment to finding out what happened to Mary, even if it was nearly 40 years too late. But there was a problem. Some of those files weren't there. Key documents had gone missing over the years. Others were never filed properly in the first place. Witness statements were incomplete. Internal notes, especially from those early days in 1977, were either redacted or had simply vanished. And yet, what remained painted a pattern. Mary had disappeared in a 5-minute window. She had been last seen with her uncle, Jerry Gallagher, and a key suspect, according to Murray and others, had been identified early, but was never questioned formally. No charges, no interrogation, just silence. Journalists tried to piece together the missing fragments. They traced timelines. They contacted retired Gardaí. They re-interviewed locals. A few whispered the same name again and again, though no one would say it publicly. Some hinted at the involvement of a politically connected individual. Others claimed they had been told to drop it when they asked questions. Ann Boyle never stopped. With each new interview, she demanded a proper cold case unit, one with oversight, one that couldn't be interfered with. She called on the Taoiseach, the justice minister, even the president. She filed formal complaints. She posted videos. She begged anyone who had been there that day, anyone who had seen anything, to come forward now. Not for her, for Mary. And slowly, the world began to respond. In the years following the documentary's release, international attention returned to the case. Articles appeared in major outlets. Podcasts covered the story. Mary's name was spoken by people who hadn't even been born when she disappeared. And with that pressure came new voices. A second retired Garda, in private correspondence with a journalist, confirmed that they too had been aware of a suspect early on, but were told it wasn't worth pursuing. A civilian came forward claiming they'd heard a confession years ago, but had never told anyone, fearing it would tear the community apart. Others said they remembered seeing strange behavior in the days after Mary disappeared, people burning clothes, rearranging storage, acting nervous. None of it was conclusive, but it wasn't nothing. Every rumor, every whisper, every unspoken sentence that suddenly found a voice, it began to form a web, not of guilt, but of knowledge. Someone knew, multiple someones. The case was referred again to the Garda Serious Crime Review Team. They promised a full re-examination. But the problem with cold cases isn't just the evidence, it's time itself. People forget. People die. Memories bend. Records go missing. And yet, the heart of the story remained. Mary Boyle, a child, taken, hidden, and a twin sister still holding the broken mirror. Anne met with investigators. She told them what she'd learned, what others had told her, what didn't make sense. She begged them to subpoena those who had stayed silent for decades. She pushed for a coroner's inquest, a formal legal investigation into the circumstances of Mary's disappearance. To this day, it has never been granted, but Anne kept going. She turned her sister's disappearance into her life's work. She stood in the rain outside courthouses. She sat across from politicians and watched them avoid her eyes. She organized vigils. She walked the field again and again, standing in the exact place her sister was last seen, imagining her 6-year-old self watching Mary disappear over the hill. All the while, the Gardaí released sparse updates. They acknowledged new lines of inquiry. They promised diligence. But no arrests were made, no body found, no resolution. Still, something had shifted. Mary's case had once been little more than a fading file in a forgotten drawer. But now, it was a symbol of broken systems, of silenced victims, of the cost of not speaking up. In the years since 2016, multiple journalists, investigators, and activists have joined the effort to keep Mary's name in the public eye. They've hosted events, held press conferences, pushed lawmakers to declassify restricted files. Several have claimed there is still someone living in the area who knows the full truth and who has never spoken. Whether out of fear, guilt, loyalty, or shame, they remain silent. But the web is tightening, not around guilt, around responsibility. Because Mary Boyle didn't just vanish, she was disappeared. And the community, the country, the government, they've all had chances to bring closure. But have they? Or have they simply waited for memory to fade? Anne doesn't forget, and thanks to her, neither can we. Because something surfaced, not a clue, not a witness, not a body, but a truth that had been buried. Mary Boyle didn't vanish into the mist. She was lost in the silence, and silence, like a wound, only festers when left untreated. For nearly 5 decades, the truth about Mary Boyle has remained just out of reach, like something glimpsed in fog, visible for a moment, then gone again. But what if the truth was never hidden in the shadows? What if it was there all along, in the daylight? Anne Boyle believes it was, and she's not alone. By the time Mary had been missing for 40 years, the people closest to her were no longer pleading for hope. They were demanding truth. Not a vague theory, not another promise. The real story, the full story, no matter how painful. Because over time, the truth had begun to leak, in memories, in interviews, in court documents, and quiet confessions. And it wasn't a fairy tale. It was worse. It wasn't a masked stranger in the woods. It wasn't an accident swallowed by the bog. It wasn't some tragic twist of fate. It was someone Mary likely knew. Someone who had been close, trusted, familiar. The Gardaí have never officially confirmed the suspect's name, but retired officers and journalists have. A man who lived nearby. A man mentioned in multiple witness statements. A man believed to have been protected, shielded, possibly by someone in political power during the 1970s. According to multiple sources, including statements in The Untold Story, a well-known Irish politician at the time made a phone call, not to demand justice, but to stop a suspect from being questioned. A quiet call, no record, no paperwork, just pressure. Just silence. The investigation, it's said, stopped that day. A possible suspect was left alone. Why? Because the man was connected. Because Donegal was a tight-knit place. Because shame travels faster than truth in small towns. And because no one wanted to believe the worst, that a child had been harmed. And the system had looked the other way. That's the revelation. It didn't come with sirens. It didn't come with a body. It didn't come with a confession scratched into stone. It came slowly, in conversations, in interviews, in old men breaking down in kitchens decades later, in sisters holding each other in front of flashing cameras, demanding someone finally say what had never been said. Mary wasn't forgotten. She was silenced. And what makes this story unbearable is that many people believe her killer never left Donegal, that they lived their life, went to weddings, sat in pubs, walked past vigils, and said nothing. Because no charges were ever filed, we cannot name them here. But for those who've followed the case closely, who've studied the documents, heard the testimony, the picture is painfully clear. The wound was never just Mary's disappearance. It was the wall built around it, a wall of influence, of fear, of calculated silence. And behind that wall stood a little girl, crying out for someone to speak for her. Anne Boyle did, again and again and again. She pointed to names. She demanded investigations. She walked the streets with her sister's photo in hand, even when others called her obsessed, emotional, unstable. But who wouldn't be? Anne wasn't just fighting to find out what happened to her twin. She was fighting to find out why no one else ever did. In one interview, she said, "There are people alive today who know what happened. They know, and I don't understand how they can live with themselves, because I can't." That is the revelation. That truth doesn't always come with handcuffs or headlines. Sometimes truth arrives like a quiet realization in the back of your mind that someone should have said something and didn't, that someone should have searched harder and stopped too soon, that someone knew a child had been harmed and kept living like nothing ever happened. The heartbreak of Mary's case isn't just her loss. It's that the truth might already be known, and if it is, then silence became a second crime, and complicity a third. The truth is no longer buried in a field. It's buried in people, in memories unspoken, in houses that still stand, in names never said aloud, but known by everyone. That's the cruelest twist of all. Not that Mary vanished, but that someone, somewhere, let her. Even now, after all the stories, all the whispers, all the promises and pressure and pleading, Mary Boyle has not been found. And that is the part that breaks people. Because what do you do with a mystery that feels solved, but still isn't? You know the shape of it. You know the timeline. You know the faces and the field and the names not said out loud. You even know the weight of the silence that followed. But what you don't know, not really, is where Mary is. That's the final cruelty, the not knowing. There's a small grave in County Sligo. It belongs to Mary's mother, Anne Sr., who passed away in 2005. She died without ever learning what happened to her daughter. Some say she died from a broken heart. Others say she died from knowing too much and never being able to say it. Her grave doesn't have Mary's name on it, because Mary doesn't have a resting place. There's no funeral, no final photo, no ribboned memorial in a churchyard. Just an absence that has lasted longer than Mary's short life ever did, and even after decades we still don't know. Where is she? Was her body buried in a bog, hidden in a well, burned, moved? Is she near her grandparents' house, the place where she laughed that morning? Or somewhere miles away, taken far from where anyone thought to look? And what about the people? What about those who were there that day? People who knew Mary, saw her hours or even minutes before she vanished? Have they all spoken honestly? Or have some withheld pieces? Quietly, carefully. And why? To protect someone? To protect themselves? Or because too much time passed, and now they believe silence is safer than truth? We still don't know what exactly happened in the hours after Mary was last seen. We don't know what the original Gardaí heard or ignored. We don't know how high the pressure reached, or how many files were altered, hidden, or lost. There's still no inquest, still no arrest, still no body. What we do have are patterns. The pattern of silence, the pattern of fear, the pattern of systems that failed a 6-year-old girl. Not once, but again and again. And we have pain, the kind of pain that doesn't go away with time, that grows deeper, heavier, more bitter with every year that passes without closure, the kind that lives in families and is passed like inheritance. Anne Boyle still doesn't know what happened to her twin. She has theories, she has evidence, she has names, but she doesn't have closure, and that's what makes this story a wound instead of a scar, because a scar says, "This has healed." A wound says, "This still bleeds," and Mary's case still bleeds. Every time a mother locks the door at night, every time a child is let out of sight for a moment too long, every time a politician makes a promise and breaks it, every time a file goes missing, every time a town chooses silence, Every time a family asks, "Please, just tell us where she is," and no one answers. The case of Mary Boyle isn't over. It may never be. And that may be the hardest part of all, the possibility that after all this, no arrest will come, no final truth, no exhumation of some buried shame, just silence. But still, there's a kind of power in not knowing, because not knowing means people keep asking. Not knowing means Mary's name never leaves our mouths. Not knowing keeps the story alive, and stories, unlike people, don't die easily. They echo, they haunt, they push. So maybe what we still don't know is the thing that keeps us coming back. Maybe it's what keeps her twin sister speaking. Maybe it's what keeps journalists digging. Maybe it's what keeps Donegal uneasy. Maybe it's what keeps Mary Boyle even now from being forgotten. We still don't know the full truth, but we do know this. Someone out there does. And until they speak, this story won't end. Because it can't, because the truth has a way of waiting. And sometimes it waits longer than a lifetime. When a child goes missing, the world briefly stops spinning for the family. The clocks keep ticking, the seasons keep changing. But inside the home, time freezes. What came after Mary Boyle's disappearance was more than heartbreak. It was a slow unraveling of everything the family once trusted. Their town, their country, even each other. Mary's mother, Anne Sr., once full of warmth and gentle laughter, became quiet in her grief. In the early years, she still hoped. She still believed someone would knock at the door, holding Mary's hand, saying it had all been a terrible mistake. But the knock never came. She died in 2005, and many who knew her believe she died with her daughter's name still on her lips. Her father, Charlie Boyle, bore the grief in his own way. Proud, private, but visibly shattered. He had once been a man who could fix anything, but he couldn't fix this. He returned to that field so many times he knew the shape of every stone. He became thinner, quieter. He passed in 2019, never having learned what happened to his little girl. And Anne Mary's twin grew up in the long shadow of that day. She wasn't just a sister, she was a reminder. Every birthday, every family gathering, every ordinary day was marked by an absence she couldn't explain to anyone, who hadn't lost a twin. She carried guilt that wasn't hers. And she carried fire that most people would have let go of long ago. But she didn't. She grew up and turned her grief into something relentless, a mission. She became the loudest voice in the case, even when it made others uncomfortable, even when it meant clashing with the Gardaí, with politicians, with her own family, even when it meant standing alone. Anne became an advocate, not just for Mary, but for every missing child whose name had faded from headlines. She gave interviews, stood at vigils, and confronted ministers. She learned the law, the politics, the media game. She didn't have power, but she had a voice, and she used it. In 2017, she stood before cameras in Dublin and said, "I'm not going away. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how uncomfortable it makes people. My sister matters." And she meant it. She traveled back to Donegal again and again, retracing the same field, the same path Mary would have walked that day. She met strangers who remembered her family. She walked past people who, in her words, couldn't meet my eyes. Some supported her, others called her obsessed, but that didn't stop her. Because Mary wasn't just a memory, she was her other half, her second voice, and she wasn't going to let the country forget. But it wasn't just the family who changed in the aftermath. Donegal changed. For decades, the town of Cashellard lived in the shadow of the case. It wasn't spoken about in public. Locals would pause when the name Mary Boyle was mentioned, eyes lowering, hands fidgeting. Some felt guilt, others felt fear. A few felt shame for what had been done or what hadn't. Tourists who passed through never noticed, but those who lived there felt it in the air, in the unsaid things, in the houses people didn't point at, in the conversations that never reached their end. And Ireland changed too. Mary's case became one of the longest-running missing child cases in the nation's history. It became a symbol, not just of a tragedy, but of a failure of justice, of courage, of accountability. Her name was spoken in Parliament, her face shown on protest signs, her story taught in journalism classes as a lesson in persistence and in power's ability to silence. And through it all, her sister remained, still searching, still asking, still standing. Every time a child went missing in Ireland, reporters referenced Mary. Every time an investigation stalled, people remembered Donegal. Every time a family begged for answers, they looked to Mary Boyle and found strength. Because if one woman could keep fighting after 40 years, maybe they could too. And slowly, the legacy of Mary Boyle grew into something larger than a single case. It became a call for transparency, for justice, for memory, and maybe most painfully, for the truth, even if it comes too late. What came after Mary's disappearance wasn't just sorrow, it was movement, it was resistance, it was the realization that some wounds don't heal by being ignored. They heal when light is finally shined into the places we were told not to look. Mary Boyle's body has never been found, but her name has never stopped echoing. Even after all these years, Mary Boyle is still 6 years old, frozen in time, still wearing her lilac jacket and black Wellington boots, still walking that short path between her grandparents' house and the field, still smiling in the only photo most people know, the one where her eyes are bright, her hair pulled back, her front tooth missing. But her story has kept moving. It echoes, in subtle ways and seismic ones, in the quiet conversations held in kitchens across Donegal where people wonder what really happened that day, in classrooms where journalism students study how a case can be lost, not to time, but to silence, and on social media where strangers still comment on old videos and say, "How is this still unsolved?" Mary's name comes up now every year, around March especially. People light candles, share posts, hold vigils, hashtag her name. For some, it's just another mystery. But for many others, especially mothers, sisters, daughters, it's more than that. It's personal. Because Mary could have been anyone's child. And if a little girl could disappear in the middle of the day, in a country as small as Ireland, in a field that had been walked 100 times before, and still not be found, then something is broken, and that something touches all of us. The echoes of her story have reached far beyond Donegal. Documentaries, podcasts, independent films, investigative YouTube channels. There's an entire generation now that wasn't alive when Mary disappeared, and yet they know her name, they know her face. They feel the injustice like a stone in their chest. Some have tried to solve the case themselves. Online forums meticulously pick apart the timeline. Armchair detectives cross-reference interviews, land records, even weather reports from that day in 1977. They analyze body language in old footage. They speculate, sometimes too much. But underneath it all is something sincere. The sense that Mary deserves to be found, that she deserves truth, that she deserves to come home, and that echo, the digital echo, has done something powerful. It's kept pressure on, it's made silence harder to maintain, it's made indifference uncomfortable. Because now, anytime someone Googles Mary Boyle, they don't find a forgotten file. They find a movement. People still write letters, still send tips, still knock on doors. Some of the leads are wild, others deeply credible. But each one proves something undeniable. Mary was never forgotten. She lives in Irish consciousness, not just as a symbol of loss, but of resistance, a reminder that even the smallest voice can make the loudest sound when it refuses to stop speaking. Her case has also changed how Ireland thinks about child protection, institutional trust, and rural silence. She is often mentioned in discussions about Garda reform, about public access to cold case files, about the right of families to demand inquests and to be heard. Mary Boyle has become a mirror. When people talk about her, they're not just talking about 1977. They're talking about now, about how power works, about how secrets survive, about how justice delayed becomes justice denied. And for many, that's the most haunting part. Because if the truth about Mary is already known, then what are we waiting for? Who are we protecting? What legacy are we choosing to leave behind? The Boyle family, fractured by grief and time, still holds on to hope, not necessarily of a happy ending, but of a final one. A burial, a stone, a name in the ground instead of in the wind. They deserve that. Mary deserves that. And yet, it hasn't come. But echoes don't die. And Mary's echo, carried by her sister, by her supporters, by every journalist who's kept the story alive, still moves through Ireland like wind through the reeds, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, but always there. She's in the questions people still whisper after Mass, in the glances exchanged at local pubs, in the way children are watched a little more closely near open fields, in the prayers said by people who never even met her, but who feel her loss like their own, because some stories don't end when the people do. Some stories become part of the land, and Mary Boyle, whether she's buried in that land or beyond it, has never truly left. She is the child Ireland couldn't save, but perhaps can still honor, by telling her story, by demanding truth, by refusing silence, by remembering that even the smallest life can cast the longest shadow. And that echo? It will keep ringing until someone finally speaks, until the field gives her back, until Mary Boyle comes home.